Hey everyone, it's Reed. I want to say thanks so much for listening to the Homefront and keeping us growing. Here's what I need you to do. After you're done listening, or while you're listening, I need you to go and rate this 5 stars. Guys, you give us those ratings, more people see us, more people listen, and the movement grows. Please give the Homefront a 5-star rating today. And as always, thanks for listening. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the Homefront. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Grace Blakeley. Grace is a staff writer at Tribune Magazine and author of several books, including Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom, as well as The Corona Crash, How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism, and Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization. She is the former economics commentator for The New Statesman and a former research fellow at the Institute for Policy Research. She appears frequently in UK and international media, including appearances on BBC Question Time, ITV's Good Morning Britain, Talk TV's Piers Morgan, oh God, and MTV News. Grace, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I don't even know how I came upon you, but I'm glad I did.
I'm glad you did.
As I told you, I read your book, Vulture Capitalism. Let me go back to the 2012 presidential campaign here in the Republican primary campaign. And I promise you'll see where I'm going here. And at one point, Rick Perry, then governor of Texas, who I've known for many years, was on stage with Mitt Romney. And Perry accused him of being a vulture capitalist, of being someone who was selling out the little guy, selling out the worker, skeletonizing companies. And the reaction to Perry's brief jaunt with populism, or the idea that maybe unfettered capitalism was not a good idea, was so swift that the only thing that saved him from it was the fact that he was in support at the time of Dreamers in Texas, which is, if someone's come here and they've done their work, we should let them go to college. That was the only thing that saved him from the vulture capitalist thing. But again, that was literally 90 seconds of a 90-minute debate more than a decade ago. And now here we are in a place where, we've seen so much of this stuff. And for me, Grace, what I really want to talk to you about, I do want to discuss the book, but for me, having looked through all this, having spent so much time in politics in my life, not as an economist certainly, but just as a political operative, is that we really misunderstand how much of this, at least from my perspective, is a power dynamic. Who's in charge?
That is the question, right? So I think this is what maybe differentiates my approach from a lot of other political economists that you will read, which is that I center questions of power. And I do that in a very particular way as well. This will sound very scary to your American listeners, but I use a Marxist perspective to analyze capitalism. And what that means is that you start by analyzing the system by looking at how production works. So the kind of liberal economists want us to treat capitalist societies like they're these kind of nice free market utopias. They want us only to look at the market. So people buying and selling things to each other, right? And then you see, lots of small traders and producers and efficient markets and all those nice things that we're supposed to equate with capitalism. When you look at production, you see things very differently. This is how Marx developed his theory all those years ago. It's because he looked at what was going on in the factories in the Industrial Revolution and was like, we need to understand this if we want to understand capitalism. And so his insight was to say, right, if you look at production in a capitalist economy, what you see is this divide between the people who own all the stuff that we need to produce everything in our society, and then everyone else who's forced to work for a living. So the insight from Marxism is that those people who own all the stuff and their friends in politics who make all the rules, because the capitalist state exists to kind of support and reinforce the interests of those owners. That divide between the people who own all the stuff and make all the rules on the one hand, and then everyone else, is the divide that explains pretty much everything that goes on within capitalist societies. And that is a power inequality.
One of the core pillars of the book is about the idea of a planned economy, especially Americans. When Americans think of a planned economy, we think of China, the Soviet Union, Gauss plan, right? The 5-year plan, all this other stuff. Your take, and I think it's a fascinating one, and you just described it, which is we live in a planned economy, but there are a very specific number of people who are planning it for their own benefit, with the help of, as you said, the state, basically, right? So maybe the state isn't at the center of the planning, but that doesn't mean it's not going on.
100%. If you look at the theory of why we have this divide between allegedly centrally planned societies and free market societies, the idea is that a free market system is supposed to be so decentralized and so devoid of concentrations of power that no one can really make plans. They can try, but ultimately they'll be overwhelmed by the power of the market. Because if you're a small business owner and you try to push up your prices too high, then another small business owner will come in and undercut you and take all your customers. That's how the market equilibrates itself, basically. That's how it retains this sense of balance through these forces of supply and demand and competition. But as soon as you strip out the pressure of competition, you suddenly give these business entities an immense amount of power to be able to make plans and implement those plans. And that's exactly the situation we find ourselves in today, because the American economy, the global economy, is dominated by these massive multinational corporations that are basically just able to do whatever they want. They don't have this pressure from potential competitors. They don't really exist in kind of free market situations. Amazon isn't worried about a competitor coming in and taking their market share. They're more worried about buying up every potential bit of, industry that they can to expand their power.
Or finding somebody who is selling on their platform, recreating it, selling it cheaper to push them out of business.
Exactly, right? Exploiting their market power to plan, to do whatever they want. And so that's like the corporate planning side of things, which is really important because that's a huge, part of how our economy works. So much of economic activity actually just takes place within corporations. But then, you might say, oh, okay, well, yeah, sure, we have problems with monopoly, but ultimately we just need the government to step in and regulate these monopolies so that the economy can function more effectively and make it kind of more akin to like a free market ideal. But the problem is that the government is in bed with the monopolists. So this was something that when the book came out last year, when I started writing it a few years ago, it was very controversial to say that, big businesses were working with politicians to plan the economy. People would be like, oh, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. And then lo and behold, a few years later, we literally have a billionaire working with the president to plan the economy. So this is just something that's now come out and become very, very obvious. But again, my argument is that this isn't an aberration. This is inherent to the structure of capitalism. Look at Trump bringing in Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, as his Secretary of State during his first term. Look at the very close relationships between the Biden administration and various different massive corporations, and we can get into that. Look all the way back to the origins of capitalism, when you had the East India Company, which was this joint venture between the British state and a merchant class with the ambition of basically spreading colonial power across the globe. There's always been this fusion of public and private power in service of basically the interest of elites. That's how capitalism works.
Right. I guess if you went back to, like, even Adam Smith didn't think that was a good idea, right?
Yeah, so you've read the book. You remember that quote from Adam Smith where he said the East India Company is, and this is the quote, a strange absurdity because it is a merchant in disguise of a state. So Adam Smith had this very, it's a view of capitalism that doesn't take into account power. It views the system as this kind of like decentralized, self-balancing, self-sustaining system. And for Smith, it was very important that the economy, i.e., the market, these little market interactions with the corporations making pins and the corporations making bread, they were all in their own little system. And then the government was completely separate to that. And the government's role in Smith's view was just to make those market interactions function effectively. So when he sees the East India Company, which is in many ways it's integral to the formation of global capitalism. He's like, this doesn't fit within my framework. This isn't like a small little baker competing with lots of other bakers on his street to try and sell bread at the highest price. This is a bunch of merchants working with one of the most powerful governments on the planet to colonize another country. And he's like, that can't be capitalism. But it is capitalism.
Gosh, it must be 2021. I was back in Washington, D.C., with my daughter, and we were visiting some friends. And I happened to run into a guy who I'd done some work with previously on the corporate side for a development deal, all of the things that you're now talking about. And he introduced me to a friend of his who was a lobbyist for a very big company, huge company, Grace. And, Biden was 5, 6 months into office. And I was like, "Well, how you see in the world?" He's like, "Oh man, I mean Biden, we just don't know like what's going to happen, what's going to, regulation." And I'm like, "You guys haven't been regulated in 30 years. Like, what are you talking about? Like, when's the last time somebody told you no? When's the last time you acquired something or you merged or you did this that somebody was like, "No, can't do that." And this is one where I think something I've seen a lot of the videos. I follow you on Instagram, follow Grace on Instagram. Grace is there's also the discussion, what you said right at the top and what I said about Rick Perry. We're not even allowed to have a discussion about another option or even a critique of the system under which we live without being said, well, Grace, you're a full blown Maoist. And Reed, what's happened to you? Right? Are you about to wave your red flag of revolution? Like, and I think back about this not only as an economic plan, but also as a political plan, whether or not it was Friedrich Hayek or von Mises or any of these other people. And I'm sorry to nerd out to the listeners. But, they get together in Switzerland after World War II and they say, like, here's what we think should happen. Now, then you get Milton Friedman and you go on. So, like, it took 60 or 70 years, Grace, but like they did it. And that's one thing that I think is also, I've tried to explain to some of my friends, and I often come off as an egghead. I'm like, guys, and I just let me narrow it down to American politics. And I'm like, guys, what we're seeing now did not happen overnight. It did not happen 10 years ago when Trump appeared. Like, they've been at this for decades, right? So, like, broaden it out. Like, Mao was in the countryside for decades. Ho Chi Minh washed dishes in New York City, right? Long before he ever went back to North Vietnam, right? Like, and so, like, what we sometimes forget in the historical, political, economic aspects of this is like dedication, resources, and will, right? Like, matter. And until and unless you're going to have a countervailing force that is willing to say, what do we believe in? What do we want the world to look like? And what do we believe is going to do the best for the most number of people? Right? If we're just nibbling around the edges, we're not going to get anything different. Now, there will be a collapse of some kind, I'm afraid, right? And then we'll have to figure out where the hell we go from there. I think that's one thing that I found fascinating about what you talked about is like, there is no countervailing force, right? Like the Democratic Party, from an economic perspective here in the US, is not different economically from the Republican Party. Maybe it is in the way they talk, but in maybe even in the way they act vis a vis taxes on the highest earners, right? But it's not really that different.
Exactly. And that is what this bogeyman neoliberalism was all about. And we talk about Hayek and Friedman, but also politicians like Thatcher and Reagan. They again had this narrative of we want to shrink the state and create free markets. Lo and behold, that is not what they did. The state became extremely big, extremely powerful, used extensive force to crush anyone who attempted to resist. And then when, if you're a bank in need of a bailout, suddenly there's infinite funds available to you. So that state under neoliberalism, under those politicians, did not shrink. But what those politicians did do is use the power of the state to crush what was the countervailing force. So if we look back over the last kind of 100 years of the history of capitalism, whether that's in the US or the UK, when have we had genuine attempts to kind of promote equality, to really create some constraints on exploitation, on the power of the rich, to really create accountable democratic institutions? It hasn't just been because rich people suddenly turned around and decided, you know what, actually, we don't want to have this much power. We don't think it's sustainable. It was because workers and citizens came together and formed movements that could not be ignored. I really like to say, like, left politics did not emerge out of intellectuals going to working class communities and telling them, have you ever considered forming a union to fight for a higher wage? No, that politics emerged out of people's struggles for a better life. That's what gave us the New Deal. It's what gave us the NHS in the UK, is what gave us all of the victories that have been won that we now take for granted and that are being eroded by these governments. They all came from these forms of organizing. And neoliberalism was not about shrinking the state. It wasn't about creating free markets. It was about crushing that countervailing force so that there would be no opposition, as you were discussing, within the state or within society or within the economy. And it allowed political parties from both sides of the aisle to converge around this kind of common sense, which completely excluded the labor movement. It completely excluded popular accountability, it excluded people, and instead said, we are the experts. we are an enlightened political class that can govern you by creating markets, and markets are efficient, and everyone will benefit when we create those markets and when we expand free trade and liberalize finance and you know liberalize investment flows across borders. That will make you all better off. You just have to trust us because we're the experts. Again, no countervailing force, no opposing views, because they'd all been crushed. And then after, of course, the bubble, which makes it seem like the system is working very well, suddenly the whole thing collapses. And then there's no countervailing force to say, well, hang on a minute, guys. This whole system that you've been doing has been unsustainable for a while. We need to change things around. And instead, you just have this sterile, meaningless debate between these two hegemonic parties that have been in charge just watching the whole thing crumble. They created the model, and now they're telling us that if we want to get back to prosperity, we need to rebuild the model.
I'm going to make an admission that, and I am really not proud of this. In 2009, I lived in Sacramento, California, which, if you don't, it's a lovely place with lovely people. And I worked for a public affairs firm, Grace, and I got an assignment from my boss, from a client, to write an op-ed for a very prominent college professor about why bailing out homeowners during the economic crisis was going to lead to moral rot.
Moral hazard.
Yeah. And I was in the belly of the beast, right? Like, I mean, I worked for oil, I worked for tobacco, you name the bad guys, I worked for them, right? And it was, as I look back on that now, I remember having a conversation just a few years later with a friend of mine who was a very senior bank guy. And they had just gotten in trouble for something else altogether. And I said, you guys do this again, like the torches and the pitchforks are going to come for you, and I'm not going to feel bad, right? Like, you guys keep doing this. And to me, that is also antithetical to capitalism, which is not only should there be competition, but risk and accountability, which is if you make bad bets and you take shitty risks and it blows up in your face, that's your fault. The problem we have now is that it keeps being our fault, or not our fault, but our responsibility. It redounds to our issue, right? And now I think the US, just to take a quick tangent, we've been able to just print money on our way out of it, right? So, like, because we're the world's printing press, so we can do that. But that has an end point too, and I think we've seen a little bit about that when I want to get to that in a second. But that's the part to me which is so fascinating is, I have worked for, again, lots of bad companies who do bad things. But I've also worked for plenty of people who claim to be liberal. But when you bring up the idea of organized labor, Grace, like the top of their head comes off, right? Like, you want to do what? You want me to do what? And which I always find fascinating because is, again, another aside. In the state of Nebraska a few years ago, and in several other places, Nebraska is a very conservative state. There was a ballot measure, a referendum, to increase the state's minimum wage to $15 an hour. And you know what? It passed with flying colors, right? So the voters in and of themselves are not opposed to the idea that somebody shouldn't have to work for $7.25 an hour, right? Which is, I don't know, adjusted for inflation, it's probably got to be like $3. But the idea is you have to circumvent in some ways the system, because the system is saying, no, 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 no. You're the radical, you're the threat, you're the communist, right? Like, you want to own the means of production. Like Lena Khan here in the US, right? She was running the FTC. She was taking a lot of these big corporations to task for the first time since the goddamn Sherman Antitrust Act, right? And people are like, she's a statist. What is she doing? And even some liberal billionaires are like, the first thing Kamala Harris should do when she gets elected is fire Lena Khan. I'm like, no. Lena Khan is what we want. She's the one who's saying, here's how this stuff is supposed to work, and it's not working.
And like, if you think back to the original anti-monopoly acts in the US, this is a really interesting point, right? Because we have Lena Khan, who came to power, who has been writing very eloquently about the problem of monopoly power in the American economy.
Yeah, since she was like in her 20s, right?
Exactly. Like, she's, got her finger on this issue. She understands it very, very clearly. There's no real kind of economic question around the fact that the American economy is too concentrated in terms of the fact that there are a small number of extremely powerful businesses that can basically price gouge, as well as having all sorts of other issues, the reduced investment, lower levels of productivity, lower wages, etc. She knows all of that. Biden comes to power, and probably like the one progressive thing that he does, other than the NLRB, is put Lena Khan into that position, right? And because I would argue that has happened through basically an elite decision rather than necessarily a mass movement, it didn't end up embedding because the people who were going to suffer as a result of that decision, they marshaled all of their power to try and fight back against that. Whereas the original Antitrust Act, that came from a broad campaign across the US that brought in unions, that brought in ordinary citizens. There was a huge society-wide debate going on about the problem of those trusts.
Yeah, the original progressive movement.
Exactly, the original progressive movement. Exactly, right? That was really powerful. And that is what gave you, the New Deal, along with the Sherman Act, along with, a much greater role for unions across the US. And it was the defeat of that movement, really, that led us up to the situation that we're in today, which is just this extraordinary imbalance of power within American society that's actually reflected all around the world, really. And I'm so interested in what you were talking about having worked for all of these guys. And, the first thing that they will say in response to any attempt at particularly unions, right? So they hate unions. I thought it was so interesting that you said that the thing they hate the most is the idea of unions. You can say, oh, we might raise your taxes a bit, and they'll be grumpy about it, but they're not going to lose their shit. If you say we're going to form a union, that's
Right.
it. You're
Forget it.
you're done, right?
Right.
Because it's confronting their power, not just their wealth. And their wealth, of course, comes from their power, right? So this kind of battle, and I suppose it is a battle, it cuts to the heart of what American capitalism is really. If the people who own the means of production and their allies within the state cannot rely upon a quiescent and obedient labor force, then capitalism doesn't function.
I want to go back to something. In the 90s, I was in high school and college, right? And so this was Pax Americana, right? The Cold War was over. Liberal democracy and globalization had won, right? Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, all this. And so if you go back and watch Ross Perot's 1992 infomercial, it was an actual infomercial here, Grace. He bought 30 minutes of broadcast television time, which in 1992 we had cable, but and he went through what was going to happen if NAFTA passed, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And what was the thing that SNL made fun of? The giant sucking sound of all the jobs. He talks about how Japan and all these other countries, are investing in their infrastructure, investing in their workers. He told us what was going to happen, and it happened. And but for the fact that Ross was a little squirrely, a lot squirrely, right? Like he provided a fundamentally different viewpoint to George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton, right? That was very popular, right? I mean, he's the last third party candidate in this country. Didn't win any electoral votes, I understand that, but to achieve a significant number of popular votes, right, based on an idea that was not quote unquote in the mainstream. But I want to say a couple more things about the neoliberalism pieces, which in this time, and maybe it's an okay boomer thing, Grace, is like we see so many of the people who were architects of that here in the US who won't go the away, right? Like you guys, like you're like, oh, we have to do this, we have to do that. Trump is so bad, blah, 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 blah. How do we get here? I'm like, you guys got us here. You deregulated the banks. You crushed labor. You sent all the jobs away. You had people convinced that trading a cheap house for a cheap television was a good deal. Like what? Now you want to come back and give us more? Like, do you want to drive us deeper into the arms of this asshole? Because that's what you're going to do. And that, to me, it's the arrogance of people who have never been told they've been wrong. And like, this is where like I grew up in Washington, D.C. I grew up with a dad in Capitol Hill. I'm a political Nepo baby, like 1,000,000%. Right. But maybe, and maybe it's because Grace, if I hadn't been in those places as a kid and as a young adult working for the likes of George W. Bush and John McCain, or having worked for these companies, maybe I wouldn't be able to step outside myself and see this, right? Maybe it's necessary for that. I couldn't have done it, let's put it that way. But this is one of those things now, like, you guys are asking for more of the same when at least the American people, or in your case with Brexit, they were saying, we don't want it. And it's not even like it wasn't about immigration, right? And here, it wasn't like anybody believed Trump was necessarily going to be better, right? Like, that's the really fascinating thing. MAGA, Grace, never promises that they're going to make your life better. Like, it's really a
Yeah.
fascinating political movement where they're like, no, you're angry, we're angry. You're going to get screwed, but we'll keep you angry. And everybody's like, that sounds great. And now, if you look at public opinion surveys, and I'm not talking about the stuff with like Trump, right, and his numbers, but like, what do people say? At least he does something. He said he would do something and he's doing something. Now, there's a lot of insidious evil. Don't get me wrong, right? But this is what makes them so good at what they do, is that they have chosen the things to keep otherwise disadvantaged people, like so many I met when I was on the road last fall, angry, distracted. At least it's not me, right? But again, the whole idea now is that we now have a fully formed, governmental corporate thing where everything's now just a transaction, right? We see it with Apple, right? Like 145% tariffs on China, not for Apple,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Not for
Crazy.
Google, right? And like, that's not an accident.
There were two things that you said that I think basically really captured the last kind of 50 years. First is that they had people convinced that trading a cheap house for a cheap TV was a good idea. And the second one was that MAGA never promises that that it will make your life better. So the first one, trading a cheap house for a cheap TV, this really cuts to the heart of what happened during that transformation of the global economy that we saw from that kind of end of history moment, right? Because we had globalization, but that doesn't just mean a more integrated world, right? That is a specific form of kind of neoliberal globalization, which involved, yes, more free trade, but also the liberalization of financial flows, of investment, the creation of lots of rules and norms around things like intellectual property that would kind of determine what countries could and couldn't do. So it would kind of limit their sovereignty. It involved the creation of things like investor state dispute settlements, which is basically when a company is able to sue a government that implements regulation that harms that company's profits in an international court, completely separate from a national jurisdiction. This architecture that facilitated the transformation of the global economy from the 1980s onwards, it was built in a very particular way with very particular interests in mind. And that did involve what a lot of critics from both left and right said it would involve, which was the hollowing out of economies in the global north. So the basically as an attempt to defeat organized labor in the manufacturing sectors in the rich world, those jobs were offshored. People say it's because of efficiency. That's not what it was. What had happened was that workers had become too powerful, too strong. In the UK, they shut down the economy in the 70s. It was the similar sort of situation in the US. A lot of workers had much more power than bosses were comfortable with. And so as a response to that, they were like, great, well, now we can just move this company to China and we don't have to deal with your bullshit anymore, right? It was a disciplining thing.
To a building where they have to put nets under things because people keep throwing themselves off the roof.
Exactly, right? So those jobs are offshored to the global south. And you get this hierarchy of global production where extremely poor countries extract mineral resources, middle income countries have these horrible jobs like, ridiculously long work weeks where they're putting together, iPhones and textiles and just extremely intensive, low paid manual labor. And then the rich world specializes in financial services and ancillary industries, law, professional services, marketing. You know, the rich world becomes almost like a global head office for global production. They're managing this globalized process of production. So all of the kind of office functions take place here. And that creates lots of nice, good jobs for relatively well-off people here. And everyone else gets to work in the coffee shops and the service sectors and the construction sectors that allows those people to kind of get on and have nice lives. And it all relies upon this liberalization of finance, liberalization of trade, which ultimately, for reasons that we probably don't have time to go into now, but I wrote about in my first book, blew up. It was very obvious that that was going to happen, by the way. And when it did so, it basically broke apart that model where the rich world gets to kind of sit in as the head office of global production. And the housing thing comes into it really importantly, right? Because all of that money that was being sucked into economies like the US and like the UK, that via one route or another ended up going into property. At the same time, those deregulated banks were able to create unprecedented amounts of money in debt that they funneled into our pockets to make us feel like we were getting richer and richer personally. And that stabilized the model. And all of that debt is what fed into the financial crisis. But as soon as that model collapsed, it's gone. And we don't have cheap houses anymore because those house prices have been basically artificially inflated by financial institutions. We have cheap TVs manufactured by those extremely hyper exploited workers in the global south. But we can't afford the houses that we need to put those TVs in unless you're one of the uber wealthy who did actually end up benefiting from this model. So this whole system of neoliberal globalization it's sat on this kind of fundamental contradiction, these fundamentally unsustainable dynamics that it was possible to see way back in the 80s and 90s. And people did see it. The left protested at Seattle and various other of the World Trade Organization meetings. Even those on the right accept some of the arguments that they made, which is true, which is that people are going to lose jobs. And this is a backlash, which is basically reiterating those arguments, but not from a kind of enlightened perspective that allows you to see the big picture and understand how this global system works, from a reactive perspective of, I want back what's mine, and you are the ones who've taken it away from me. But instead of identifying the real people who took it away from you, which is the people who oversaw this model being rolled out and the people who benefited from it, it's immigrants or lazy, social security claimants or whatever else. And that takes the teeth out of the left's critique, which is we need to rebalance power. Because the right comes in and says, no, we just need to end globalization and kick out all the brown people. And then you don't have a movement anymore because it's split up into these opposing camps.
Let me add one piece, which I think is actually puts things as you're describing them into reverse, which is you have the American right saying in globalization. But of course, like even with tariffs, like they know that like manufacturing in any significant way, like we're not going back to Allentown and steel mills, right? Like that's not going to happen. Yeah, you're right. There's the bright, shiny objects. But then on the left, right, at least the Democratic Party is like, no, everything was great, right? Everything was good. And here's the thing, like I was having a discussion with a very smart friend of mine. He's like, well, if you look at it decade over decade, like life expectancy, blah, 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 is all much better. And I said, look, maybe it is, but here's the point. People don't believe it. People don't feel it. And when they don't feel it and they know they're getting screwed, they react. And I was just reading another book about a professor who went to Germany in 1957. It was a book called They Thought They Were Free. And he talks about how this idea of like, they ultimately reacted. And Lincoln said, God must love the little guy. That's why he made so many of them. Right. And so to your point, and now that's what I want to get into is now I saw a clip of you. It might've been this morning or yesterday where you were talking at an event about the idea of, we are so atomized, and that's not an accident either. Right. That is very much part of the whole idea. And, it could be labor, it could be community organizations, whatever it is. I didn't get to watch the end of it, but the thing that somebody asked you, and I got asked this question that I was telling you about right before went on is, what can I do? What can I do? Because that's the other part is what I talk to a lot of people, whether or not it's very wealthy donor types, my friends, people who I've met on the road, right? What can I do? What can I do? And I think that's part of it, Grace, which is, it's not just that we're all atomized, that we're all separated. It's that the system seems so overwhelming that the tsunami is upon us. Like, what am I supposed to do other than run for the hills?
I'm writing a new book now actually about individualism and these problems of collective power. And that's exactly what I'm writing about. It links back to what you said again that I didn't get to cover, MAGA never promises that they're going to make your life better. So why do people vote for these parties? Because the defining political emotion of the 21st century is powerlessness. People confront the forces that we've been discussing over the course of this show as these, sweeping, all powerful, all consuming forces that dominate their lives. You can see the power of big multinational corporations. You can see the power of the American state. You can see the power of, media institutions, all of these very obviously, self-interested concerns who dominate and control so much of what goes on in so many areas of our lives. By the way, they control what we see on the shelves, what we see on TV, what innovation happens, how much our houses cost, all of these different things. We don't get a choice, over those things. Really, we can choose between the options that they've laid out for us, but they're the ones that get to make all those decisions. So you look at that structure and you think, I feel completely and utterly powerless. And this was the other thing about neoliberalism that you mentioned, which was the defeat of those collective movements like the labor movement. It was partly about disrupting their collective power to be able to kind of undermine, you know, bosses' interests, right? It was about disrupting their ability to go on strike, all of those very obvious things. But it was about something more than that too. It was about undermining the links that bound working people together. It was about making us feel like we are alone. So it's not just that the system is really powerful, it's that you confront it as this one isolated individual and you don't feel like, okay, well, my boss has refused to raise my wage in line with inflation. So I'm going to go chat to my coworkers and we can all band together and decide what we're going to do about this. No, you think, okay, well, my boss has refused to raise my wage. So that basically means I'm taking a pay cut. What shall I do? Maybe I should take out another job. Maybe I should take out a loan. You like take on all that responsibility on your own shoulders as this one isolated individual, and you feel stressed and anxious and scared. And in response to those feelings of powerlessness, of fear, of isolation, I see basically two routes, one of which is generally taken by the right and one of which is generally taken by the left. Leftists will feel despair often. They will be like, I am so angry about the state of the world. The powerful is so powerful. There's nothing I can do about it. And like so many of them will become like angry or depressed or resentful and will kind of sink into this pit of like anxiety, right? If you're on the right, you react with anger. It's like these people have made me feel powerless. And particularly if you're a man, right? You're like, I don't want to feel powerless. I want to feel strong. I want to feel in control of my life. I want to feel capable. And so what do? You identify with someone who you feel has those traits. Someone like Trump, right? Who is a strong leader, who it doesn't matter if he's going to make your life better, as you just said, that makes you feel powerful again. It's not really make America great again. It's make Americans feel powerful again. That's what Trump is promising. And it all comes back to this issue of the fact that we feel alone and isolated, confronting forces that are so pervasive that they feel impossible to resist. Now, the answer to that is not actually either despair on the left or anger on the right. The only answer to both of those issues is coming together with people in your community, in your workplace, in your society, and realizing that you do have power. There's a reason they've spent so long trying to convince us that we are alone, trying to crush the unions, trying to put people in prison for protesting. It's because those things work. And as soon as we start doing them again, we realize a sense of our own power and we realize how the system relies on our obedience. It relies on us staying quiet. And as soon as we stop doing that, chinks start to open up and the light starts coming through. And we start thinking, oh, you know what? I don't have to feel despair. I don't have to feel this rage. I can marshal all of these emotions that I have about living in this unjust system and put them into something useful.
So there's a couple of things. So I just came upon this idea maybe yesterday, Grace, about the right versus the left in America, which is if you think about the core of the Republican Party, right? There's a significant evangelical Christian aspect to it. But at its core, what does that give them? A place where millions of people congregate every week as a matter of course, right? They're there, right? They are in community, right? Look, it might be very, very toxic and ugly and antithetical to Jesus, certainly, but they're all there and they're all together. And you talk about that. I thought about this, which is the left had that. It was called the Union Hall. But now There's no third place for that. The right has their third place. It's not home, it's not work, it's the church. The left, it wasn't home, it wasn't work. It might have been the church and the union hall, right? Now, the left, to your point about the despair, and listen, if there's a group of people who despair at the drop of a hat, it's the American Democrat.
Yeah. Oh, there's nothing we can do. I guess we have an oligarchy now.
Oh, well, right. What are we supposed to do? I'm like, well, you could fight, but that's really ugly. And I don't like to get my hands dirty. And like, okay, well, then, And so I've really thought about that, which is, and this is why, like the stuff that we do at our organization, the union, we actually call it the union, is just about getting people together. And in many cases, it's apolitical, right? They're community meet and greets. Obviously, like we're a political organization. We're not going to deny that, but we're not asking people to come and, sign up for a political party or support a candidate. We're just trying to get people off their couches and off their phones because, to your point, like that loneliness, which is, I think, in many ways an epidemic, feeds on itself. And you sit there and you look at your phone and you see somebody on a private jet and you say, why can't I have that? Well, it turns out that the private jet is actually some asshole paying $2,500 to sit in a hangar in Las Vegas, but you don't know that, right? Like it all conspires, to your point, make us feel like there is nothing out there, that there's nothing we can do. And I think that is one thing that we must start to get over. And this is one thing that I will say, Grace, that you understand, I think, as an activist and an economist, which my friends in politics don't understand. This is not about the next election, right? This
Yes.
is not about November 2026. Stop talking about the presidential race of 2028. I don't even know if we're going to have one, right? Guys, the house is on fire with us in it. Could we try and figure out how to put it out before we decide we want to buy a new one, right? Like, so to me, that's one of those things that like is so important and it can happen. And what I've told my friends is like, coach a team, help out at the food bank. I mean, let me just say, it's 2025 in the United States of America, the most powerful empire humanity's ever known. We still have food banks. It's an outrage to me. But that's one of those things where we have to start. And to your point, this is counterintuitive. Going after Trump politically actually is unhelpful because you give his supporters something to glom onto and you give his political acolytes someone to hide behind. And look, the Republican Party is just as unpopular as the Democratic Party in this country, right? Nobody likes either party. And they've been around since 1854. So, they've changed, but whatever. But like my point is like, if you want to start to defeat this stuff, it's like a gigantic Jenga game, right? Like you have to pull those little pieces out one by one, right? If you start at the top, you might get there, but by the time you've gotten there, like what do you have? You're exhausted and 100 years has gone by. So you have to start at the bottom and pull those little pieces out. And so that's to what you said is like you have to get involved in your community. You have to get involved with these people. People that you haven't met. Look, I went to a county council meeting last night, right?
Amazing.
I love that. Like, I love local politics. And we have a rapacious developer who I am like just all about. I used to work for rapacious developers. So that's the other part too, is I know their tricks. So that's one of those things that I think is important. And it's important to see those people and to build that community. And what we have asked, and I'd love to see what advice you give to people, is if we're going to have a meeting of 20 people, okay, we're going to do this again in a month. Each person here has to bring one person, right? Bring one person. Next time, let's get to as close to 40 as we can. All right. 2 weeks after that, I want it to be 80. Because here's what I want to do. And I promise I'll shut up after this, Grace, is that for those first 20, that they are not only force multipliers, but if they have shown up a third time, they are now a community of their own, right? The first time is a meeting. The second time is, hey, it's great to see you, Grace. The third time is, Grace, tell me what's happening. What do we need to do, right? And now those second 20 people, right, are now on their second meeting, right? And by the fourth meeting, they're the community, right? They're the core. And this stuff is not easy. It's not fast, but it is the only thing to build a long-term, durable alternative. And I promise I'll shut up after this, Grace, that will be in place to do something when Trumpism, MAGA, whatever it is, inevitably collapses because they always sow the seeds of their own destruction.
I actually didn't want you to shut up at any point during that answer because I love hearing that. I love hearing that. And look, I mean, when you were saying, what can I do? Which I realized I didn't answer last time. I get that question all the time, which is why I started this Substack column. So I've got my own Substack, and as part of that, once a week, I write this column called What Can We Do? And the first entry was, I get asked all the time, what can I do? And I always respond, you are asking the wrong question. On your own, it doesn't matter how many tote bags you buy or how many cans you recycle or like how ethical a consumer you become, or, it doesn't matter how you vote, but it's not like, the be all and end all in terms of politics. You need to start thinking much more broadly than that. And instead of asking, what can I do? Ask, what can we do? So, as part of this, I've been interviewing organizers from all over the world about what they're doing in their place. So, this has looked like I interviewed some students in Serbia who are involved in the biggest protests in their country. In fact, that Eastern Europe has seen for quite some time over corruption.
Since the war, probably, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Over the corruption of the government, and they're basically bringing down the government. And their whole thing is, we have lived under this system of corruption, of a kind of oligarchy for a very long time, and we're not standing for that anymore. And we're building this mass movement, and it was super inspiring. I spoke to a couple of weeks ago federal workers who were organizing to resist Trump. I spoke to one of the guys who was helping them form this federal workers union that is a little bit more kind of militant than some of the other federal workers unions, and getting people out onto the street during, the protests, and resisting what Trump and Musk are trying to do within the federal government as well, using all the means that they have available to them. I've spoken to workers at Starbucks who came together in their stores and just said, hey guys, do you think that maybe we should form a union? Because like we're not getting paid enough, and we're not being treated very well either. And so that's what they did. I've spoken to climate activists who are trying to build bonds with workers in the labor movement to say, how do we create a just transition that's going to allow us to kind of produce clean energy and also protect your jobs? I've spoken to so many people. I actually spoke to an amazing activist in New Orleans who started an organization called Southern Solidarity. And it was basically like she saw loads of homeless people on the street during COVID. And her whole thing was like, how do I actually deal with this problem through solidarity, not charity? So not me getting loads of money and then going out to these people and saying, I'm here to save you, but actually bringing together a community. So people within that community and saying, look, we have this issue. People are out on the streets. You're probably struggling to pay your rent as well. Maybe you can't, get access to healthy food. So let's build this cooperative and go out to people, build relationships with them, build trust, bring them in, feed them, sure, and then they become part of this movement. It was an absolutely fascinating conversation. So there's like so many different things that you can do depending on how politicized you are, depending on where you are, how old you are, whether you're in work, right? And as you said, it is just about bringing people together because we all know that this system is failing us.
You're the sounding board and everybody listening for so many of my cockamamie ideas. Maybe you tell me, but so you think about, like, I'm bad at math, Grace. So just
So am
go with
I.
me. So there's the x-axis, right?
Yeah.
And in politics, it would be left and right, or within the Democratic Party here in the U.S., it would be the progressives and the moderates. I think that's the wrong axis. I think the axis you're talking about is the y-axis, and I think that we've spent way too much time up here, and we have to spend more time down here. Because the other part is that when you go from the top of the y-axis to the bottom, it's not just a straight line, it's actually a funnel. And what that means is that as you get closer to the ground where people are actually living their lives, you strip away a lot of the bullshit that doesn't matter, right? Because now they're like, look, I am homeless. I'm really happy you care about issue X, but I am homeless, right? I have to work 2 jobs. My mom has to live with me to look after my 2 kids, right? Your world is dedicated to trying to figure out not how to build a better life for your family, but to survive, right? And that's the other part too, which is the American dream. The American dream has been, we've talked about it for, I don't know who came up with it, right? Probably, I don't know, somebody on Madison Avenue in the 50s. That is one of those things where, like, if you're going to spend all your, look, I say this to all my friends on the left. If you want to call Trump supporters mouth-breathing nitwits online all day, have at it. Just don't assume that you're doing anything,
Yeah.
right? Like, because you're not. It's really easy to get in an echo chamber too, right? And for me, it's like, as soon as I feel like the echo chamber is coming, like, I feel like I have to find a hammer to knock myself out of it. And I think, to me, those are the things where Again, we have to reorient. When I meet the guy in a black neighborhood in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where this neighborhood has not improved in decades, probably, he's just gotten home from work. It's a Saturday. I'm a middle aged white guy right there. Like, first of all, why did they send me there? I'm not entirely sure, neither here nor there, right? But I'll talk to anybody. He's just gotten home from work. What does he say? I asked, Trump or Harris? It's a coin flip, both parties. It's a coin with snakes on both sides. Trump is all about himself. I guess Harris is the lesser of two evils. I'll vote for her. You know what, Grace? That guy didn't vote.
Yeah, 100%.
Because this is what a very senior member of the AME church, the African American church in Detroit, once said to me. My people are going to do one of two things. They're going to vote for the Democrat or they're going to stay home. But here's what they know. They look out their window and their lives don't change. Now, that could be inner city Detroit, a rough neighborhood in Grand Rapids, or a suburb, right? A worn down suburb in Ohio, Nebraska, California, you name it, wherever it is. And I'm sure the UK has many of these same things too, which is you guys made us this promise and it's bullshit. Now, how are we going to figure this out? And my fear is that we have to start at the bottom, as we've talked about. We have to build this framework, but there's going to be an awful lot of bad stuff that happens in the meantime. And that's the other part of the solidarity piece, which I think is so important, is like in my state of Utah, the state legislature gutted all funding for spousal and child abuse. Okay. In the state of 3.5 million people, not a big state population wise, right? The town I live in, right, where we have a location that takes care of battered women and families. I live in a wealthy enclave. Like, we'll make it up, right? We'll figure out how to make sure they keep their doors open. There's a lot of places in this state where, like, that's it, right? And so if we don't take care of each other, then the cavalry isn't coming, right? And my fear is that that's going to get worse in the coming. I mean, we're 90 days into Trump, and look where the hell we are. I'm afraid that the next couple of years, not only here in the U.S., but of course, we're just the middle of so many things, that it's going to get worse for a lot of people. And until and unless we start to do what you're talking about, which is get together, then there will be no hope. Those green shoots will not grow. So tell me, am I wrong? Am I right? Tell me what you think.
Any change on this scale is hard and it's long and it produces setbacks. You know, I don't think anyone can come in and say, my way of doing politics is going to alleviate all of your suffering and it's going to be fun and easy and there's not going to be any struggle involved. Look at how long it took to end apartheid in South Africa. How many people died over the course of that struggle? How many people died before even seeing the end of that system? How many people lived in conditions that we just, can't even imagine today? It is the same with all of these unjust systems. How hard do you think those early workers, people who were going down mines, people who were working in manufacturing, in industry, in conditions that were just awful. In the UK, we had like children working in heavy industry in like the 1800s. These people, they lived through moments of extreme crisis, of suffering. You only had to fast forward a few years and then after the Industrial Revolution, and you'd be in one war and then another war and famine and economic crisis at the same time as people have very little or nothing to show for their lives except for community, right? In all of these examples, things have seemed hopeless. I would say more hopeless than they are today, right? In a lot of ways. If you think about the scale and the intensity of the suffering that people were experiencing and the complete and utter um, just separateness of the elites, because there weren't these same democratic systems that were in place for us to be able to actually shut things down and say enough is enough. And those people still fought. Not only did they fight, there were people involved in these movements who produced works of art, literature, poetry, gave speeches that were about hope, that were about imagining a different kind of world. Even when they were literally workers who were like losing arms and legs in factories, and economic crises means that they lose their arm and then they lose their job and they haven't got any social security, there would still be leaders of these movements standing up and saying, there is a better future for us. Even though it doesn't seem like that is possible to win right now, it does exist. And that hope allowed them to fight to create the world that we live in today. And that world is again in crisis because there's always going to be something. Even if we manage to create a world of complete, utopian fairness and justice and everything, we'd still be dealing with climate breakdown. We'd still be dealing with, loads of other issues. Like there's always going to be a crisis. There's always going to be a struggle. We cannot be so myopic as to think that the point at which we live in history is the hardest and most difficult and most crisis ridden moment that we've ever experienced, because it's not. People have fought through harder times and won much bigger battles. And they've done so by refusing to give in to despair, by refusing to turn on each other, and instead coming together and realizing that they have collective power. And those are the people who we need to be learning from.
I don't think I can finish it any better than that. Grace,
Good.
tell us where we can find you online. Tell us what else you're working on. Tell us about your next book, when it'll be out. I hope you'll come back when it does.
Absolutely. Well, it's going to be a while because I'm literally just starting it right now. So it will probably be a couple of years. That tends to be how these things work, unfortunately. But I'm doing all my research at the moment. And basically, I'm looking at how we became isolated and individualized and what impact that's had on us in terms of our mental health and our relationships and our work. And then I'm looking at how we can escape that. So all of those little green shoots that we were talking about of hope and of solidarity and of collective power, I'm going to be interviewing lots of people to learn from them, basically. And in terms of where you can find me, I am on Substack. That's where you can find my column, What Can We Do? It's just at Grace Blakeley. I'm on Instagram at Grace Blakeley. I am on Twitter, X, whatever, but I don't really use it very much anymore. You can find me there at Grace Blakeley. Basically just Grace Blakeley, anywhere. Any platform that you use, I'll be there.
Awesome. And as always, gang, you can find me on Twitter, TikTok, says.us, at Reed Galen, Instagram, and Threads at Reed_Galen USA. And of course, also on Substack, guys, at The Home Front. Grace Blakeley, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Reed. It was great to chat to you.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.